Good evening, dear friends, and welcome to Watson's Margins. I'm Edward, your companion for another evening of careful deduction. Tell me, is your lamp burning steadily tonight? Perhaps there's rain against the window, or simply the profound quiet that follows a long day. These are the hours when Dr. Watson would take up his pen, recording truths that society preferred to forget. If you find solace in these investigations, do subscribe. Now settle in. For as Holmes understood, what men fear to lose reveals more than what they hope to gain. Chapter 1. The House of Respectable Silences. It was upon a grey afternoon in late October that Lady Margaret Ashcombe called upon us at Baker Street, bringing with her an atmosphere of restrained distress that spoke more eloquently than any words of her troubled state. I had been engaged in cataloguing certain notes upon tropical diseases when Holmes, who had been occupied with his chemistry bench, suddenly abandoned his work and turned toward the window. I believe I must have known him for 7 years, yet I was no closer to understanding how he perceived the approach of visitors before they had so much as reached our door. He moved to his chair with that peculiar economy of motion which characterized his periods of active interest, and by the time Mrs. Hudson announced our guest, he was settled with every appearance of having anticipated her arrival for some considerable time. Lady Ashcombe was a woman of perhaps 50 years, dressed in mourning of impeccable quality that spoke of established means rather than recent grief. Her features bore the marks of beauty that had aged into dignity, and her carriage suggested generations of assured position. Yet there was about her eyes a tightness that betrayed sleepless nights, and her gloved hands clasped a reticule with rather more force than the circumstance warranted. Holmes rose with his customary courtesy and gestured toward the chair opposite his own. I moved to take my accustomed place, notebook at hand, as our visitor settled herself with the careful precision of one accustomed to maintaining composure under observation. She wasted no time in pleasantries. I have observed that those who move in elevated circles often dispense with the social niceties when genuinely troubled, as though their distress grants them license to abandon the very conventions that otherwise define them. My late husband served the Foreign Office for 30 years. She began without preamble. He was knighted for his discretion. Our family has maintained a reputation for reliability in matters of state. We are not given to drama, Mr. Holmes, nor to seeking assistance from outside our sphere. That I am here at all should indicate the gravity of my concern. Holmes inclined his head slightly. You refer to the household of Sir Reginald Ashcombe, I take it. Your brother-in-law. He resides in Belgrave Square, does he not, and has not been seen in society for some 6 weeks. Lady Ashcombe's composure wavered for an instant. You are well informed. I am merely observant, Lady Ashcombe. The Times has noted his absence from several functions at which his presence would ordinarily be expected. Your mourning dress is of sufficient age to suggest that your husband's passing was not recent, yet you introduce him first, as though establishing credentials. You come to me not because you distrust your family, but because you distrust the situation in which they find themselves, and you arrive precisely at the hour when a lady of your position might be expected to be taking tea, suggesting that your visit must remain unobserved by those who monitor your daily routines. Our visitor's eyes widened slightly, and I saw her regard shift from polite attention to something approaching hope. You see a great deal, Mr. Holmes. I see what is presented, Holmes replied with a dismissive gesture. But I suspect you have not come to test my powers of observation. What troubles the house of Ashcombe? Lady Ashcombe drew a breath and began her account. Sir Reginald had been her husband's younger brother, she explained. He had inherited the family estate upon his brother's death 3 years prior. He was a man of rigid principles, diplomatic training, and considerable authority. The household in Belgrave Square was governed according to his exacting standards. Within it resided not only Sir Reginald but also her own son, Arthur, who stood to inherit the estate in due course. Arthur's cousin, Edward Ashcombe, occupied rooms there as well, being dependent upon Sir Reginald's charity after certain unfortunate financial reversals. There was also Sir Reginald's daughter from his first marriage, Miss Caroline Ashcombe, a young woman of 23 whose prospects in society were carefully guarded. Finally, the household included Mr. James Fenwick, Sir Reginald's private secretary, a man of modest origins who had risen to a position of considerable trust through years of devoted service. "It is a household of dependencies," Holmes observed quietly. "Each member requires something from Sir Reginald, whether inheritance, shelter, social standing, or employment. A household where gratitude must be demonstrated and favour maintained." Lady Ashcombe nodded. "It is also a household where nothing occurs without Reginald's knowledge and approval. He maintains order through expectation and through memory. He forgets nothing and forgives very little." "Yet something has disturbed this order," Holmes prompted. "Letters," Lady Ashcombe said, and her voice dropped slightly. "From Berlin. They began arriving 6 weeks ago, addressed in a hand that Reginald claimed to recognise, though he would not say whose. They were written in some form of cipher or code. He received perhaps 8 or 9 in total. After the first few arrived, his manner changed. He became withdrawn, spent long hours in his study, and began making reference to correcting historical records and setting matters right. Did he indicate what required correction? He spoke in hints and suggestions. He mentioned that reputations built upon incomplete knowledge were unstable foundations. He implied that certain arrangements within the family might require revision. He said that loyalty must sometimes give way to truth. I leaned forward in my chair. Did he threaten to disinherit anyone specifically? "He did not threaten," Lady Ashcombe replied carefully, "but he created an atmosphere of anticipation. The household became watchful, my son grew anxious, Edward became defensive. Caroline withdrew into herself. Even Mr. Fenwick, who has always maintained perfect composure, began to exhibit signs of strain." "And the letters themselves?" Holmes asked. "Locked in a drawer in his study. He keeps the key upon his person. He permits no one to enter the study in his absence, and he has changed the household routines to ensure that he is never disturbed when working there." Holmes was silent for a moment, his fingers pressed together in that attitude of concentration I knew so well. When he spoke again, his tone had sharpened. "Lady Ashcombe, you have described a situation of considerable tension, but no actual crisis. What has brought you to me today rather than last week or next?" She met his gaze directly. "Because this morning, Reginald informed the household that he intended to make certain facts public within a fortnight. He said that his conscience demanded it, and that those who had benefited from his silence must now face the consequences of truth. He said it calmly, over breakfast, as though announcing a change in the menu. And the reaction of the household? No one spoke, Lady Ashcombe said quietly. No one asked what he meant. They simply looked at one another, and in their faces I saw not curiosity, Mr. Holmes, but recognition. Whatever Reginald intends to reveal, they already know it, or they fear they know it. Holmes rose and walked to the window, gazing down upon Baker Street with that distant expression that indicated rapid calculation. When he turned back to us, his decision was evident. "I shall call upon Sir Reginald tomorrow afternoon," he announced. "You will provide a letter of introduction, presenting Dr. Watson and myself as old acquaintances of your late husband, who have expressed interest in his diplomatic papers. It is a thin pretext, but it will serve to gain us admission." "And what will you seek to learn?" Lady Ashcombe asked. "What it is," Holmes replied, "that so thoroughly binds a household in silence that truth becomes more frightening than deception. I have observed, Lady Ashcombe, that when respectable people conspire to maintain appearances, the truth they hide is generally less dangerous than the consequences of its revelation." Our visitor departed shortly thereafter, leaving behind the letter of introduction and an impression of profound unease that lingered in the room long after her footsteps had faded upon the stair. Holmes returned immediately to his chemical apparatus, but I noted that his movements lacked their former absorption. His mind was already at work upon the problem. "We have been invited, Watson," he remarked without looking up, "into a house where everyone has something to conceal, and no one dares to speak plainly. It is precisely the sort of situation in which truth becomes a weapon and silence an agreement. I made no reply, sensing that he was speaking more to himself than to me. Outside, the October afternoon darkened toward evening, and somewhere in Belgrave Square, a household of respectable silences waited for the revelation that would shatter its careful order. I confess that I did not then foresee how swiftly that revelation would arrive, nor how terrible would be its cost. Chapter 2. A Matter of Correspondence. The house in Belgrave Square presented a facade of such unimpeachable respectability that I felt almost guilty approaching it in the company of my friend, as though we brought with us the taint of suspicion into a realm that had hitherto remained above such considerations. It was a residence of the sort that announces wealth without ostentation, where the very brickwork seems to have absorbed generations of careful propriety. We were admitted by a butler whose bearing suggested he had been trained in an era when service was considered a vocation rather than mere employment. He examined Lady Ashcombe's letter with a thoroughness that bordered upon the judicial before conducting us to a drawing-room of such studied elegance that I found myself instinctively moderating my voice. Holmes, however, appeared entirely at ease. He moved about the room with that deceptive casualness which I had learned to recognise as acute observation, pausing before a portrait here, examining the arrangement of furniture there, all while maintaining a flow of inconsequential remarks about the weather and the character of the neighbourhood. We were kept waiting perhaps a quarter of an hour, a duration I suspected was calculated to remind us of our position as supplicants for Sir Reginald's time. When at last we were summoned to his study, we found ourselves in a chamber that served as both office and fortress. The walls were lined with documents and dispatch boxes, each labelled with a precision that spoke of a mind that trusted nothing to chance or memory. Sir Reginald Ashcombe rose from behind a mahogany desk of ministerial proportions. He was a man of perhaps 60 years, lean and upright, with the sort of face that suggested a lifetime of making difficult decisions and standing by them regardless of consequence. His eyes held the peculiar flatness I had observed in certain military commanders, men who had learned to view the world as a series of problems requiring solution rather than a landscape inviting sympathy. "Gentlemen," he said without warmth, "my sister-in-law's introduction speaks of an interest in diplomatic history. I confess I am surprised. The papers of my late brother contain nothing that has not been properly archived." Holmes smiled with perfect courtesy. "Indeed, Sir Reginald, and it is precisely that archival rigour that interests us. Dr. Watson is preparing a monograph upon the evolution of diplomatic practice during the period preceding the present troubles in Europe. Your brother's reputation for discretion was legendary." Sir Reginald's expression did not soften, but I detected a subtle shift in his posture, as though Holmes had said something that engaged his attention despite himself. "Discretion," he repeated. "Yes, that was Geoffrey's particular gift. He understood that history is not merely what occurs, but what is permitted to be recorded." "An interesting distinction," Holmes observed, settling into a chair without waiting for invitation. "It suggests that some events are deemed unworthy of permanent record, or too complex to be reduced to memoranda without distortion," Sir Reginald countered. He remained standing, maintaining the advantage of position. "The Foreign Office deals in nuance, Mr. Holmes. Black and white judgments are the luxury of those who need not balance competing interests." I noted that Holmes had succeeded in transforming what should have been a brief courtesy visit into something approaching a philosophical debate. Sir Reginald, despite his evident desire to dismiss us, found himself drawn into conversation as though compelled by the rare experience of intellectual opposition. They spoke for some minutes about the nature of diplomatic record-keeping, and it was during this exchange that I observed the first tangible evidence of the disturbance Lady Ashcombe had described. Upon Sir Reginald's desk lay several sheets of paper covered in what appeared to be columns of letters and numbers. They were arranged in deliberate order, and beside them sat a leather-bound notebook in which Sir Reginald had evidently been making annotations. Holmes's gaze flickered toward these materials with such brevity that I doubt Sir Reginald noticed, yet I knew my friend had absorbed every visible detail. When next he spoke, his tone had shifted almost imperceptibly. Lady Ashcombe mentioned that you continue to receive correspondence relating to your brother's work. It must be gratifying to know that his reputation endures. Sir Reginald's hand moved almost involuntarily toward the papers on his desk, then stopped. He studied Holmes with sudden intensity. My sister-in-law is indiscreet. She should not have mentioned my private correspondence. Forgive me, Holmes said smoothly. I assume such letters were a matter of professional pride. When a man's work continues to generate interest years after his service has concluded, it speaks to lasting influence. The letters are not about Geoffrey, Sir Reginald said sharply. They concern matters that predate his involvement. They are, in fact, deeply unwelcome. The admission hung in the air between us. I saw Holmes register it with that slight narrowing of his eyes that indicated a hypothesis confirmed. He rose from his chair and moved toward the window with apparent casualness. Unwelcome correspondence can be destroyed, he remarked. Yet you retain these letters and appear to be decoding them with considerable care. That suggests they contain information you require, however distasteful you may find their arrival. Sir Reginald's jaw tightened. You presume a great deal, Mr. Holmes? I observe, Sir Reginald. It is my particular talent. Holmes turned from the window. These letters originate from Berlin, are written in cipher, and arrive in a hand you recognise. They concern events from your own diplomatic career, not your brother's, and they have prompted you to reconsider certain historical records that you yourself helped to create. The silence that followed was profound. Sir Reginald stood motionless, and I could see the calculations passing behind his eyes as he assessed how much Holmes might have already learned through other channels. "Who has been speaking to you?" he demanded at last. "No one has spoken," Holmes replied calmly, "but your household has altered its routines. Your secretary now intercepts the morning post before it reaches your desk. Your servants have been instructed to note visitors and deliveries with unusual care. These are not the habits of a man receiving congratulations or academic inquiries. They are the precautions of someone expecting a threat." Sir Reginald moved to his desk and gathered the coded letters with deliberate motions. "I believe, gentlemen, that this interview has concluded. Whatever Lady Ashcombe may have told you, my correspondence is not a matter for external investigation." Holmes made no move toward the door. "With respect, Sir Reginald, I suspect your correspondence is very much a matter that will require investigation. The question is whether that investigation will be conducted privately and with discretion, or publicly, and with all the attendant consequences. Are you threatening me?" "I am offering you an observation," Holmes said quietly. "A man in your position does not respond to mere letters with the level of anxiety currently evident in your household, unless those letters threaten more than personal inconvenience. They threaten revelation, and from your reaction, I deduce that the information they contain is accurate." Sir Reginald's face had gone very pale. "You know nothing of the circumstances. Then explain them to me," Holmes suggested, "or allow events to unfold as they will, and hope that the truth, when it emerges, proves less damaging than you fear." For a long moment Sir Reginald stood in evident internal struggle. Then, slowly, he returned to his chair and gestured for Holmes to resume his seat. When he spoke again, his voice had lost its authoritative edge. During the Berlin Conference of 1895, he began, certain assurances were given to representatives of the German Foreign Office regarding British intentions in East Africa. These assurances were documented in memoranda that were subsequently amended before being entered into the official record. The amendments were minor, but they had the effect of presenting British policy in a more favourable light than was strictly warranted by the facts. "You falsified diplomatic records," Holmes stated without inflection. "I ensured that history would not be complicated by temporary expedients that no longer held relevance," Sir Reginald corrected. "The substance of policy remained unchanged. Only the phrasing was refined. And now, someone who possesses the original documents is reminding you of that refinement," Holmes said. Sir Reginald nodded slowly. "The letters contain passages from the original memoranda. Whoever writes them has access to documents that should have been destroyed 30 years ago. They are not demanding money, Mr. Holmes. They are demanding that I correct the historical record, that I acknowledge the alterations and explain why they were made. I felt compelled to interject. But surely, Sir Reginald, if the changes were as minor as you suggest, the correction would cause little harm. Sir Reginald looked at me with something approaching pity. Dr. Watson, I have spent my entire career building a reputation for absolute reliability. Diplomacy rests upon trust in the accuracy of records. To admit that I altered documents, for whatever reason, would destroy not only my own standing but cast doubt upon every negotiation in which I participated. It would provide ammunition to those who wish to paint British diplomacy as fundamentally dishonest. Holmes leaned forward slightly. And there are others who benefited from your alterations, others who might be implicated if the truth were revealed. Sir Reginald said nothing, but his silence was confirmation enough. You have 2 weeks, Holmes said, before you intend to make a public statement. What happens during that fortnight will determine whether you control the revelation or whether it controls you. I suggest you give serious consideration to who in your household would be most harmed by your confession and who might be most desperate to prevent it. We departed shortly thereafter, leaving Sir Reginald to his coded correspondence and his troubled conscience. As we walked back toward the heart of London, Holmes maintained his characteristic silence until we had reached a suitable distance from Belgrave Square. "Well, Watson," he said at last, "what did you make of our diplomatic friend?" "A man caught between honour and reputation," I replied. "He wishes to do the right thing, but fears the consequences." Holmes shook his head slightly. "No, Watson. A man who wishes to do the right thing does not wait 30 years before discovering his conscience. Sir Reginald fears something, certainly, but it is not merely his own disgrace. He fears what his revelation will force others to acknowledge. And in a household where everyone depends upon his favour and his silence, that makes his continued existence a matter of considerable inconvenience to several parties. You suspect murder?" "I suspect nothing yet," Holmes said. "But I observe that we have been invited into a house where the truth has become a loaded weapon, and where several people have excellent reasons to ensure that weapon is never fired." He said no more, but as we made our way through the darkening streets, I could not shake the sensation that we had set something in motion that would not easily be contained. Chapter 3. The Sealed Study. The telegram arrived at Baker Street shortly after breakfast on the following morning, delivered with such urgency that Mrs. Hudson brought it up herself rather than waiting for a more convenient moment. Holmes read it without visible reaction, then passed it to me in silence. The message was brief and signed by Lady Ashcombe. Sir Reginald found dead in study. Door locked from within. Police summoned. Your immediate attendance requested. Holmes was already reaching for his coat. I had learned long ago not to waste time with unnecessary questions when action was clearly required. Within minutes we had secured a hansom and were making our way through the morning traffic toward Belgrave Square, at a pace that suggested our driver had absorbed something of Holmes's sense of urgency. The household was in a state of controlled disorder when we arrived. The butler who admitted us maintained his professional demeanour, but I could see the shock in his eyes and the slight tremor in his hands as he took our hats. We were conducted not to the drawing-room, but directly to the upper floor, where a small knot of people had gathered outside the door to Sir Reginald's study. Lady Ashcombe stood somewhat apart from the others, her face pale but composed. Beside her was a young man of perhaps 30 years whom I took to be her son Arthur, the heir to the estate. He possessed his mother's fine features but lacked her self-possession, shifting his weight from foot to foot with barely suppressed agitation. A second man, older and softer in appearance, stood with his back against the corridor wall, arms folded across his chest in an attitude that might have been defensiveness or shock. This, I assumed, was Edward Ashcombe, the impecunious cousin. A young woman sat upon a chair that had been brought from one of the bedrooms, her hands folded in her lap with such rigid control that I could see the white of her knuckles. Miss Caroline Ashcombe, clearly, possessing her father's austere features rendered more delicate by youth and femininity. Finally, a thin man of middle years stood closest to the study door, his attention fixed upon its panels with an intensity that suggested he was willing it to open through sheer concentration. Mr. James Fenwick, the private secretary, whose entire world had evidently been contained within that room, and the man who occupied it. Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard was present as well, examining the door with professional thoroughness. He looked up as we approached, and I saw relief cross his features. "Mr. Holmes," he said, abandoning formality and his evident need for assistance, "I am very glad Lady Ashcombe thought to send for you. We have a situation here that defies ready explanation. The door is locked from the inside, I take it," Holmes said, moving immediately to examine the frame and hinges. "Bolted and locked both," Lestrade confirmed. "The key is in the interior lock. We can see it through the keyhole. The bolt is shot home. The windows, I am told, were latched when the household retired last night, and the study is on the second floor with no convenient access from outside." "When was Sir Reginald last seen alive?" Holmes asked, addressing the question to the room at large. It was Mr. Fenwick who answered, his voice carefully controlled. "I brought him his evening correspondence at 9 o'clock. He dismissed me at 9:30, saying he intended to work for another hour before retiring. That was his custom." "And this morning?" "I knocked at 7 o'clock as usual," Fenwick continued. There was no answer. I assumed he had overslept, which was unlike him but not unprecedented. At 8 o'clock I knocked again, more forcefully. When there was still no response, I informed Lady Ashcombe, and we determined that the door should be forced. Holmes turned to Lestrade. "You have not yet entered?" "We were awaiting the locksmith," Lestrade replied. "But given the circumstances, I thought it best to delay until you had examined the door in its present state." Holmes nodded his approval and dropped to one knee to peer through the keyhole. I watched as he remained in that position for what seemed an interminable period, his eye pressed to the aperture, occasionally shifting his angle to gain different perspectives. At length he rose and examined the upper frame of the door, running his fingers along the wood with delicate precision. "The key is definitely in the lock," he announced. "The bolt is shot. There are no tool marks on the frame to suggest the door was forced and then resecured from outside." Holmes turned his attention to the floor, studying the threshold with minute care. "No dust has been disturbed in a manner suggesting the door was opened recently and then closed again." "Then how did anyone leave the room?" Arthur Ashcombe demanded, speaking for the first time. His voice carried a note of hysteria barely held in check. "If my uncle is dead inside a locked room, surely it must be natural causes or self-inflicted." "We shall determine that once we have gained entry," Holmes said mildly. "Inspector, I believe we are ready to proceed." Lestrade produced a heavy implement and applied it to the lock with practised efficiency. The mechanism yielded after several forceful blows, but the door itself remained immobile. The bolt, of course, still held it secure. There, a second application of force splintered the frame sufficiently for the door to swing inward, revealing at last the interior of Sir Reginald Ashcombe's final refuge. The study was precisely as one might expect of a man of Sir Reginald's character. Every object occupied its designated place. The curtains were drawn but not fully closed, admitting enough morning light to illuminate the scene without glare. The windows were indeed latched from within, their mechanisms undisturbed. The fire in the grate had burned itself out, leaving only grey ash that stirred faintly in the draught from the open door. Sir Reginald sat in his chair behind the desk, his body slumped slightly forward, his head resting upon one outstretched arm. His eyes were closed, and his features held an expression of profound weariness rather than pain or fear. Upon the desk before him lay the Berlin letters, no longer in cipher but transcribed in his own neat hand. Beside them sat his leather-bound notebook, open to a page covered with what appeared to be the beginning of a formal statement. Holmes moved forward immediately, gesturing for the others to remain in the doorway. I followed, my medical training asserting itself over any other consideration. I reached Sir Reginald's side and conducted a swift examination. though I held little hope of finding life. The body was cold, the rigour beginning to establish itself in the smaller muscles. I looked up and shook my head at Holmes. "Dead for at least 8 hours," I said quietly. "Probably longer." Holmes made no reply, his attention already absorbed by the scene before him. He examined the desk without touching anything, his gaze moving from the letters to the notebook to Sir Reginald's hands, which lay in positions suggesting he had been writing when death overtook him. He studied the chair, the floor beneath it, and the arrangement of objects upon the desk with that systematic thoroughness I had witnessed 100 times before. After several minutes of silence, he moved to examine the windows more closely, testing each latch and studying the frames. He knelt to inspect the fireplace, stirring the ashes with a penknife and holding up to the light a few fragments that appeared to be the remains of burned paper. Finally he returned to the desk and bent to examine Sir Reginald's face with particular attention, though he did not touch the body. When at last he straightened and turned to address the assembled company, I could see that he had formed certain preliminary conclusions, though he clearly intended to share only a portion of them. "Sir Reginald appears to have died of natural causes," he announced. "There is no sign of violence or struggle. However, I must reserve final judgment until Dr. Watson has conducted a more thorough examination and certain chemical analyses have been performed." "Chemical analyses?" Lestrade echoed. "You suspect poison?" "I suspect nothing definitively," Holmes replied. "But a man of Sir Reginald's apparent health does not typically expire at his desk without some precipitating cause. The circumstances of his death may well prove to be natural, but those same circumstances demand verification." He moved toward the doorway, pausing to address each member of the household in turn. "And I shall require individual interviews with each of you. Inspector Lestrade will arrange a suitable location. In the meantime, I must ask that no one enter this study or disturb anything within it. Dr. Watson will examine the deceased, and I shall make a more detailed investigation of the room once the body has been removed." The heir, Arthur Ashcombe, stepped forward, his face flushed with barely controlled emotion. "This is absurd. My uncle has died of a seizure or heart failure in his own locked study. There is no mystery here, only tragedy." Holmes regarded him with that peculiar intensity that could make even innocent men uncomfortable. "Perhaps you are correct, Mr. Ashcombe. Nevertheless, your uncle was concerned enough about his safety to take unusual precautions. His correspondence suggested that revelation of certain historical facts would prove damaging to several parties. And now, before that revelation could be made, he is conveniently dead in circumstances that prevent anyone from being directly implicated. I find the timing noteworthy, even if you do not." The young man paled but said nothing further. Holmes turned his attention to the others. "Each of you had reason to fear what Sir Reginald intended to reveal. Each of you benefits from his silence, and each of you was resident in this house when he died. I do not make accusations, but I observe facts. Until those facts have been fully examined and explained, I suggest that none of you makes plans to travel." With that pronouncement, he stepped back into the corridor, leaving the household to absorb the implications of his words. I remained behind to conduct my examination of the body, aware that what I discovered might transform a domestic tragedy into something far more sinister. The day had begun with a telegram announcing death. I suspected it would end with the certainty of murder, though by what method and for what specific motive remained as locked away as the room in which Sir Reginald Ashcombe had breathed his last. Chapter 4. Schedules, Silences and Small Lies. My examination of Sir Reginald's body yielded findings that were as troubling as they were inconclusive. There were no marks of violence upon the person, no signs of struggle or defensive wounds. Yet certain symptoms suggested themselves to my medical eye. The slight discoloration about the lips, the particular rigidity of the limbs, and a faint odour that I could not immediately identify all pointed toward the possibility of poison, though of what variety I could not determine without chemical analysis. I conveyed these observations to Holmes in the privacy of the study after the body had been removed to await the coroner's examination. He received my report with a nod that suggested confirmation rather than surprise. Poison administered in such a way as to simulate natural death, he mused, examining once more the contents of Sir Reginald's desk. The question, Watson, is not merely what substance was employed, but when and how it was introduced. A man who locks and bolts his door, who maintains such rigid control over his environment, does not casually consume food or drink from untrusted sources. Perhaps it was administered earlier in the day, I suggested. The effects of certain poisons can be delayed. Precisely my thought. Holmes lifted the transcribed letters with careful fingers, which means we must reconstruct not merely the final evening, but the entire day preceding Sir Reginald's death. Every meal, every visitor, every deviation from routine becomes significant. The interviews that followed consumed the remainder of the morning and extended well into the afternoon. Holmes conducted them in the library, a room chosen, I suspected, for its formal atmosphere and the psychological advantage it provided. Lestrade sat in attendance, though he contributed little beyond the occasional clarifying question. Clearly content to allow Holmes to direct the inquiry, Arthur Ashcombe was summoned first. The young man entered with an air of wounded dignity that barely concealed his nervousness. Holmes began not with questions about the night of his uncle's death, but with seemingly innocuous inquiries about the household routine. "Your uncle maintained a predictable schedule, I understand," Holmes said pleasantly. "Breakfast at 8, correspondence until 10, and so forth." "He was a man of habit," Arthur confirmed. "One always knew where to find him at any given hour." "And yet," Holmes continued, consulting notes he'd made earlier, "the servants informed me that 3 days ago the usual morning schedule was disrupted. The household staff was given unexpected leave, and several rooms were declared off-limits for cleaning. Can you explain this alteration?" Arthur's composure faltered slightly. "I was not aware of any such disruption. My uncle managed his own household affairs. I did not presume to question his arrangements. But surely you noticed when the maid who typically attends to your rooms failed to appear," Holmes pressed gently, "or when the morning newspapers arrived an hour later than customary." The young man's face flushed. "I may have noticed certain irregularities. My uncle valued his privacy during that period. He was working on his correspondence and did not wish to be disturbed." Holmes made a notation. "And the telegram that arrived 2 days ago, addressed to your uncle but delivered to you by mistake, what became of that?" "I gave it to my uncle immediately," Arthur said, but his eyes shifted away as he spoke. "It was a simple error by the telegraph boy." Holmes allowed a silence to develop, studying Arthur with that penetrating gaze that had unnerved better liars than this anxious air. After a long moment, the young man spoke again, unbidden. "If you must know, my uncle had instructed that all correspondence should pass through Mr. Fenwick before reaching him." The telegram bypassed that arrangement. He was displeased. "Why would Sir Reginald require his secretary to screen his personal telegrams?" Holmes asked. Arthur hesitated, then seemed to make a decision. He was concerned about the Berlin letters. He feared that whoever was sending them might attempt other forms of contact. He wanted Fenwick to intercept anything suspicious. And did Mr. Fenwick intercept anything? "I would not know," Arthur said stiffly. "I did not involve myself in my uncle's affairs." Holmes dismissed him shortly thereafter and called for Edward Ashcombe. The cousin entered with a deferent manner that seemed practised rather than natural. Where Arthur had been nervous, Edward appeared resigned, as though he had long ago accepted his position as perpetual supplicant. His testimony regarding the household schedule was similar to Arthur's, but Holmes's questions took a different direction. "You occupy rooms in the West Wing, I believe," Holmes said. "Your windows overlook the mews." "They do," Edward confirmed cautiously. "Then you would have observed the activity there 2 evenings ago. A carriage arrived at an unusual hour and departed within minutes. Who was the visitor?" Edward's hands tightened on the arms of his chair. "I saw no carriage. I retire early and keep my curtains drawn against the draught. The servant saw it," Holmes said flatly. "The coachman at the neighbouring house remarked upon it. You expect me to believe that you, who spend your evenings reading by the window according to your own previous statement, noticed nothing. The cousin's face had gone pale. If there was a visitor, I was unaware of it. Perhaps my uncle had business that required discretion. Holmes shifted his approach. You are dependent upon Sir Reginald's generosity for your livelihood. His death places you in a precarious position. What arrangements had he made for your future? None that he shared with me, Edward said quietly. I lived each day uncertain whether I would be asked to leave. It was not a comfortable existence, Mr. Holmes. Yet you remained. Where else would I go? My own funds were exhausted years ago through unfortunate investments. Reginald offered me shelter when no one else would. I was grateful, even if that gratitude came at the price of constant anxiety. There was a bitterness in his voice that suggested depths of resentment carefully hidden beneath layers of obligatory thankfulness. Holmes dismissed him without further comment and requested that Miss Caroline Ashcombe be sent in. The young woman entered with a composure that impressed me. She had clearly been weeping, but she maintained her dignity with admirable control. Her answers to Holmes's questions were precise and measured, offering no more information than was requested. Holmes asked about her father's habits, his recent state of mind, and any changes she had observed in the household routine. She confirmed much of what we had already learned, but added one detail that caught Holmes's attention. My father destroyed certain papers 3 days ago, she said. He spent an entire afternoon burning documents in his study. When I inquired about it, he said he was eliminating obsolete records, but I had the impression he was distressed by the task. Did you see what he was burning? Holmes asked. Only briefly. They appeared to be old memoranda, some bearing official seals. I assumed they related to his diplomatic work. Holmes leaned forward slightly. Did your father ever discuss with you the substance of the Berlin correspondence? Miss Caroline's hands tightened in her lap. He said only that the past was returning to judge the present, and that certain debts must be acknowledged. He seemed to feel it was a matter of honour, though it would cost him dearly. And cost you as well, Holmes suggested gently. Her eyes met his with unexpected strength. My prospects in society depend upon my father's reputation, Mr. Holmes. If he had publicly admitted to falsifying diplomatic records, no respectable family would receive me. I understood what his revelation would mean for my future, but I would not have stopped him. He was my father, and if he believed the truth must be told, then I supported his decision, whatever the consequences. It was a statement delivered with such evident sincerity that even Holmes seemed moved by it. He thanked her and allowed her to withdraw. The final interview was with Mr. James Fenwick, the private secretary. He entered with the careful neutrality of a man accustomed to observing without being observed, speaking only when spoken to, offering opinions solely when requested. His account of Sir Reginald's final day was detailed and methodical. Sir Reginald rose at his usual hour, Fenwick reported. He took breakfast alone in his study, as was his custom when working on sensitive matters. I brought him his correspondence at 9 o'clock. He spent the morning transcribing the Berlin letters, which he had by then successfully decoded. At noon he took a light luncheon, again in the study. During the afternoon he worked on his statement of explanation, the document you found upon his desk. At 6 o'clock I brought him his evening meal on a tray. You did not dine with the family, Holmes interjected. I rarely do. My position is ambiguous, neither servant nor family member. I generally take my meals alone. Holmes studied him with interest. You were elevated from very modest circumstances to a position of considerable trust. Sir Reginald must have valued you highly. He gave me opportunities I could never have obtained otherwise, Fenwick said quietly. I was loyal to him absolutely. And yet loyalty can become complicated when the object of one's loyalty threatens to destroy himself and all who depend upon him, Holmes observed. Fenwick's expression did not change. Sir Reginald made his own decisions. It was not my place to approve or disapprove. But it was your place to bring him his meals, Holmes said, to handle his correspondence, to have access to his study at all hours. You had opportunity, Mr. Fenwick, which is something not all members of this household possessed. The secretary met Holmes's gaze directly. I had opportunity for many things, Mr. Holmes. I also had gratitude, respect, and genuine affection for a man who had been more than generous to me. If you are suggesting I would repay his kindness with murder, you misjudge both my character and my intelligence. Holmes dismissed him without further comment, but I could see that the interview had given him much to consider. When we were alone again with Lestrade, Holmes summarised what we had learned. We have a household in which schedules were altered, servants dismissed early, and certain rooms placed off limits, he began. We have intercepted correspondence, destroyed documents, and at least one mysterious visitor whose presence is denied. We have a telegram that went astray and a series of meals brought to a man in isolation by someone who had both access and opportunity. Every person in this house has lied to us about something, whether significant or trivial. But which lies matter? Lestrade asked. All of them, Holmes replied. Because together they form a picture of a household preparing for something, not reacting to Sir Reginald's decision, but anticipating it. The question is whether they were preparing to protect themselves from revelation, or to ensure that revelation never occurred. He rose and walked to the window, gazing out at the darkening square. Tomorrow, Watson, we shall trace the sources of those meals, examine what remains of the burned documents, and determine exactly who visited this house 2 nights ago. Somewhere in the accumulated small lies of this respectable household lies the truth of how Sir Reginald Ashcombe was murdered, despite every precaution he took to protect himself. The evening had settled over Belgrave Square by the time we departed, leaving behind a house where every resident knew more than they admitted and feared more than they revealed. Chapter 5. Agreements Never Spoken. The following morning found Holmes in a state of focused energy that I had come to recognise as the prelude to significant revelation. He had spent much of the previous evening in communication with various sources, and when I descended to breakfast I found him surrounded by telegrams and notes, a half-consumed cup of coffee growing cold at his elbow. "Watson," he said without preamble, "what binds a household together when affection is absent and financial dependence insufficient to explain the depth of connection?" I considered the question while pouring my own coffee. Obligation, perhaps, or shared history. "Fear," Holmes said with satisfaction. "Mutual vulnerability transformed into mutual protection. I've spent the night tracing the histories of our principals, and a most illuminating picture has emerged." He pushed several documents toward me across the table. The first was a telegram from a solicitor in Brighton, confirming details about Edward Ashcombe's financial collapse. The second was a letter from a colleague at the Foreign Office, outlining certain irregularities in Sir Reginald's official record. The third was a report from a private inquiry agent regarding Miss Caroline Ashcombe's social connections. Holmes allowed me time to read before continuing. Edward Ashcombe's ruin was not merely the result of poor investments. He was involved in a scheme to defraud railway shareholders. The matter was hushed up through Sir Reginald's intervention and the expenditure of considerable sums. Edward was saved from prosecution, but only at the cost of absolute dependency and permanent gratitude. "And Miss Caroline?" I asked, having read the disturbing implications in the inquiry agent's report. "Formed an attachment to a young man of artistic inclinations and no fortune whatsoever. The relationship progressed beyond what society would consider appropriate. Sir Reginald learned of it and arranged for the young man to receive a commission in India, effectively ending the connection. Miss Caroline's reputation was preserved, but she knows that her father possessed evidence of her indiscretion, evidence that would render her unmarriageable if revealed. I felt a surge of sympathy for the young woman. And Arthur? Holmes produced another document. Arthur Ashcombe maintains a separate establishment in St. John's Wood, a modest house occupied by a young woman who is presented to the neighbours as his cousin, but who is in fact his mistress. She's borne him a child. Sir Reginald knew of this arrangement and tolerated it, provided Arthur maintained absolute discretion and made no attempt to introduce the woman into respectable society. I set down my cup, the pattern now becoming clear. Each member of the household is protected by Sir Reginald's silence, and bound by it, Holmes added. They are connected not merely through dependence upon his generosity, but through fear of what he might reveal if that generosity were withdrawn. It is a remarkably effective form of control. But you said Sir Reginald intended to reveal his own falsification of records, I protested. Why would a man who maintained such careful control over others suddenly abandon discretion in his own case? Holmes rose and walked to the window, his hands clasped behind his back. That, Watson, is the central question. A man does not suddenly develop a conscience after 30 years unless something forces him to confront his past actions. The Berlin letters provided that force, but I suspect they did more than simply remind him of his deception. They threatened to expose not only his own falsification, but the web of protected secrets he had used to maintain his authority. You believe the letters revealed his knowledge of the household secrets? And I believe the letters came from someone who knew a great deal about Sir Reginald's methods of control, someone who understood that his power rested not upon legitimate authority, but upon accumulated knowledge of others' vulnerabilities, and I believe that person threatened to expose not merely the diplomatic falsification, but the entire structure of protection and dependency Sir Reginald had constructed. We returned to Belgrave Square shortly before noon, where Holmes requested access to Sir Reginald's private papers. Lady Ashcombe, looking more strained than on our previous visit, granted permission with evident reluctance. The study had been tidied since we last saw it, but Holmes had insisted that nothing be removed. He spent an hour examining documents with meticulous care, occasionally making notes or setting aside particular items for closer study. I occupied myself with reviewing Sir Reginald's appointment diary, noting the careful record of meetings, correspondence, and household matters. It was Holmes who found the first concrete evidence of the tacit agreements that had governed the household. Hidden within a locked compartment of Sir Reginald's desk was a leather portfolio containing documents that could only be described as insurance against betrayal. There were bank statements showing the payments made to prevent Edward's prosecution, letters regarding Miss Caroline's indiscretion, including correspondence from the young man in India that suggested the relationship had been more serious than a mere flirtation, evidence of Arthur's separate establishment, including receipts for a monthly allowance paid to the woman in St. John's Wood, and, most damningly, a detailed record of when each piece of information had been acquired and how it had been used to ensure compliance. Holmes also discovered something unexpected. Among the papers was a letter dated 5 years earlier, written by Mr. James Fenwick and addressed to Sir Reginald, but apparently never sent. It was a confession of sorts, revealing that Fenwick had falsified certain financial records at a previous position, and had been dismissed under circumstances that would have prevented him from finding other employment. Sir Reginald, the letter suggested, had known of this deception, and had employed Fenwick despite it, creating yet another bond of grateful dependency. This household, Holmes said quietly, was built upon a foundation of mutual blackmail disguised as benevolence. Sir Reginald protected them all, but the protection came with invisible chains. We were interrupted by the arrival of Inspector Lestrade, who brought with him the coroner's preliminary report. I read it with professional interest, noting the confirmation of my own observations. Sir Reginald had indeed been poisoned, though the specific substance had not yet been identified. The toxicology analysis would require several more days, but the coroner felt confident that death had resulted from the introduction of a foreign substance, most likely administered between 12 and 18 hours before death occurred. That places the critical period during the afternoon of the day preceding his death, Holmes mused. After luncheon, but before the evening meal. He turned to Lestrade. Inspector, I require information about the afternoon's activities. Who visited? Who had access to Sir Reginald's study? And particularly, what refreshments were taken during that time? Lestrade consulted his own notes, compiled from interviews with the household staff. Sir Reginald took tea in his study at 4 o'clock, as was his custom. The tray was prepared by the cook and delivered by Mr. Fenwick. No visitors were received that afternoon. Sir Reginald worked alone from luncheon until the evening meal. Who else had access to the kitchen between the preparation of the tea and its delivery? Holmes asked. Lestrade looked troubled. According to the cook, she prepared the tray and left it on the servants' table while she attended to other duties. Any member of the household could have entered the kitchen during that interval. The servants were occupied with their various tasks. No one was specifically watching the tea tray. Holmes nodded as though this confirmed his expectations. And the tea itself? What became of the remaining portion after Sir Reginald had finished? The cup was returned to the kitchen with the tray. The remaining tea in the pot was disposed of in the usual manner. There is nothing left to analyse. How convenient, Holmes said dryly. He turned his attention back to the documents spread across Sir Reginald's desk. Watson, consider the psychology of this situation. A man who controls others through fear of exposure announces his intention to confess his own deception. What effect would that have upon those he has protected? It would render his protection worthless, I said slowly. If his reputation were destroyed, he would have no social standing to shield others. His threats to expose their secrets would carry no weight if he himself were disgraced. Precisely, Holmes confirmed. More than that, his public confession might necessitate a complete accounting of his affairs. The investigation into his falsification of diplomatic records could reveal the entire network of dependencies and protected secrets. Everyone in this household would be exposed. So they all had motive, Lestrade said. They all had the same motive, Holmes corrected. Not greed, not jealousy, not revenge. They were motivated by the desire to prevent exposure, to maintain the careful fictions that governed their lives. Sir Reginald's death was not about gaining something new. It was but about preserving what they already possessed. He gathered the documents into a neat pile and secured them. Tomorrow, gentlemen, I shall demonstrate how this murder was accomplished despite the locked door and Sir Reginald's precautions. Tonight, I must verify certain final details. Watson, I shall require your assistance in visiting an establishment in Bloomsbury. There is a chemist there whose expertise may prove invaluable. We departed Belgrave Square as afternoon shadows lengthened across the elegant facades. Behind us, the household maintained its appearance of respectability, even as Holmes prepared to strip away the carefully constructed protections that had made that respectability possible. As we walked toward the main thoroughfare to secure a cab, Holmes spoke quietly, almost to himself. They bound themselves together in silence, Watson, each holding the other's secrets, each dependent upon the continuation of that silence. Sir Reginald was not their protector. He was their jailer. And when he threatened to unlock the doors, one of them decided that murder was preferable to freedom. The implications of his words settled over me as we travelled through the darkening streets. We were not seeking a killer motivated by passion, or even by rational calculation of advantage. We were hunting someone who had killed to preserve a lie, and who had done so with the cold determination of one protecting not merely reputation, but the very foundation upon which an entire life had been constructed. Chapter 6: The Weight of Disgrace. The chemist's establishment in Bloomsbury was precisely the sort of place Holmes frequented when official channels proved too cumbersome for his purposes. Mr. Trevelyan was a small, nervous man whose legitimate trade in pharmaceutical preparations provided cover for a more specialised expertise in the identification of exotic substances. He received us in his cramped laboratory behind the shop, where the air was thick with chemical odours that made my eyes water. Holmes presented him with samples he had collected from Sir Reginald's study, including scrapings from the teacup and residue from the ashes in the fireplace. Trevelyan examined these materials with a jeweller's loupe and conducted several preliminary tests before delivering his verdict. Aconitine, he announced with certainty, derived from monkshood, a most effective poison, mister. Holmes, tasteless when properly prepared, and the symptoms can be mistaken for heart failure if one is not looking carefully. Death typically occurs within several hours of ingestion, though the onset can be delayed depending upon the dose and the victim's constitution. Could it be introduced into tea without detection? Holmes asked. Easily. A few drops of the prepared tincture would be sufficient. The victim might experience a slight numbness of the mouth, but this would be attributed to the heat of the beverage if noticed at all. And the source of such a substance? Trevelyan hesitated. Monkshood grows wild in many gardens, Mr. Holmes. Any competent person with access to botanical references could extract and prepare the poison. It requires care, but not exceptional knowledge. The plant itself is not uncommon. Holmes thanked him and secured a written statement of his findings. As we departed into the evening air, I turned to my friend with the question that had been forming since we entered the chemist's laboratory. If the poison was in the tea, and the tea was prepared by the cook but delivered by Fenwick, then surely the secretary must be our primary suspect. Holmes shook his head. The tea was left unattended on the servants' table. Anyone in the household could have added the poison during that interval. The cook herself confirmed that she was occupied with preparing the evening meal and did not observe the tray continuously. We have opportunity distributed among 5 potential suspects, Watson. We must look elsewhere for our solution. We returned to Baker Street, near where Holmes spent the remainder of the evening in what appeared to be aimless activity, but which I knew to be intensive cogitation. He played his violin with particular melancholy, filling our rooms with fragments of melody that never quite resolved themselves into coherent compositions. It was past midnight when he finally set aside the instrument and spoke. The Berlin letters, Watson. I've been approaching this matter from the wrong direction. We have focused upon the household secrets and their fear of exposure. But the letters themselves contain the key to understanding who had the greatest motivation and the clearest opportunity to commit this crime. The following morning we returned once more to Belgrave Square. Holmes had sent word ahead, and Lady Ashcombe had arranged for all members of the household to assemble in the library. The atmosphere was tense, each person eyeing the others with poorly concealed suspicion. Holmes wasted no time in preliminaries. I've had an opportunity to examine the Berlin correspondence in detail, he began. Sir Reginald's transcriptions were quite thorough. The letters do indeed reference the falsification of diplomatic records during the Berlin Conference of 1895. However, they contain something more interesting than mere historical correction. He produced the letters from his pocket and selected one in particular. This letter, written approximately 3 weeks ago, makes specific reference to the consequences of Sir Reginald's actions. It mentions by name several individuals whose careers were affected by the falsified records. But it also includes this passage, which Sir Reginald chose not to transcribe in his notes. Holmes read aloud from the original coded letter, which he had apparently deciphered independently. Your protection of those around you was built upon the foundation of your own deception. When that foundation crumbles, everything constructed upon it will collapse. Your daughter's prospects, your nephew's inheritance, your cousin's shelter, your secretary's position, all rest upon the reputation you are about to destroy. Consider carefully whether your conscience is worth the ruin of those who trusted you. The room had gone very quiet. Miss Caroline's face was pale, while Arthur gripped the arms of his chair with visible tension. Edward stared at the floor, and Fenwick stood motionless by the door. This letter, Holmes continued, was not written by someone in Berlin. The cipher used is not a diplomatic code, but a simple substitution that any educated person could construct. The handwriting, when examined closely, shows characteristics consistent with English penmanship rather than continental style. The paper itself is available at any London stationer. You believe the letters were forged? Lady Ashcombe asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I believe the letters were written by someone who had access to Sir Reginald's diplomatic papers, someone who understood the falsification that had occurred, and someone who recognised that threatening Sir Reginald directly would be less effective than threatening those he had worked so carefully to protect. Holmes moved to the window, his back to the assembled company. The writer knew details that could only have been obtained from someone within this household, or someone with intimate knowledge of Sir Reginald's methods. The letters were designed not to extort money, but to create psychological pressure, to force Sir Reginald into a position where confession seemed the only honourable course, regardless of the consequences to others. But who would benefit from such a confession? Arthur demanded. Everyone in this room would be harmed by my uncle's disgrace. Precisely, Holmes said, turning to face them, which is why the letters were not designed to produce a confession. They were designed to produce exactly what occurred, a situation where Sir Reginald's death would prevent the revelation, while simultaneously removing the man who held everyone's secrets. I felt a chill at the cold logic of Holmes's reasoning. You're suggesting that someone created the Berlin correspondence specifically to establish a motive for murder. More than that, Watson. Someone created a situation where everyone in the household appeared to have equal motive, equal opportunity, and equal means. A conspiracy of silence where each suspect protects the others, because each has something to hide. Holmes withdrew another document from his pocket. Yesterday, I examined the ashes in Sir Reginald's fireplace more carefully. Among the burned papers I found fragments that were not old memoranda but recent correspondence. Specifically, I found portions of letters that appeared to be drafts or copies of the Berlin letters themselves. The implications were staggering. Sir Reginald had kept copies of the letters that supposedly threatened him. Why would he retain copies of threatening correspondence? Lestrade asked, speaking for the first time that morning. Because, Holmes replied, he recognized them for what they were. He knew the letters were fabricated. He knew they came from someone within his household, and he was using them as a test to see who would crack under the pressure, who would reveal themselves through their reaction to the threatened confession. Then his announcement about revealing the truth within a fortnight, I said slowly, was itself a form of trap. Exactly. Sir Reginald understood that someone in his household was attempting to manipulate him. His announcement was designed to force that person's hand, to compel them to act before the fictitious revelation could occur. He anticipated an attempt against him, Watson. That is why he took such elaborate precautions with his locked study and his controlled access. But he did not anticipate the method or the timing, I concluded. Holmes nodded gravely. He expected a direct assault, perhaps, or an obvious attempt at poisoning. Instead, the murderer chose a substance that would simulate natural death, administered during a period when multiple people had access to the means of delivery. Sir Reginald's precautions were designed to prevent violence, not to detect subtle poisoning in his afternoon tea. Holmes returned his attention to the assembled household. One of you created the Berlin correspondence. One of you knew enough about Sir Reginald's diplomatic past to construct a plausible threat. One of you had access to his papers and understood his methods of control, and one of you recognized that his death, occurring before any public confession, would serve to protect not only yourself but everyone else in this household who depended upon his silence. The accusation hung in the air, unspecific yet comprehensive. I watched the faces of the suspects, seeing varying degrees of fear, anger, and calculation pass across their features. "Mr. Holmes," Lady Ashcombe said, her voice steady despite the pallor of her face, "you have explained the mechanism but not identified the murderer. Can you tell us who among us is guilty?" Holmes smiled without humour. "I can tell you that the guilty party possessed certain specific knowledge and capabilities. They had access to Sir Reginald's diplomatic correspondence, which eliminates some possibilities. They had the chemical knowledge or resourcefulness to obtain and prepare a conatine, which suggests education or particular connections. They had the psychological insight to understand how Sir Reginald would react to the manufactured threat. And most importantly, they had the courage to act alone, knowing that the success of their plan required absolute secrecy." He paused, allowing his gaze to move across each face in turn. "But I will not yet name the murderer. I wish first to confirm certain final details. Tomorrow morning I shall return, and at that time I shall demonstrate not only who committed this crime, but how they managed to poison Sir Reginald despite all his precautions, and why they believed murder was their only option." We departed shortly thereafter, leaving behind a household now united not by mutual protection but by mutual suspicion. As we travelled back through the London streets, I turned to Holmes with the frustration I had been suppressing. "You know who did it," I said. "Why not make the accusation now?" Because, Watson, Holmes replied quietly, I wish to give the guilty party one final night to contemplate their actions. Tomorrow they will face justice. Tonight they will face conscience. I have observed that murderers who kill from desperation rather than malice sometimes find that burden more difficult to bear than any legal consequence. It was a sentiment that revealed more of my friend's humanity than he typically allowed himself to display. We rode the remainder of the journey in silence, each occupied with thoughts of the terrible resolution that tomorrow would bring. Chapter 7. The Temptation of a Simple Motive. I awoke the following morning to find Holmes already dressed and engaged in animated conversation with Inspector Lestrade, who had arrived at an unseasonably early hour. The detective from Scotland Yard wore an expression of vindicated satisfaction that immediately put me on guard. "Mr. Holmes," Lestrade was saying as I entered, "I believe we have been overcomplicating this matter considerably. I've spent the evening reviewing the financial records of the household, and a clear picture has emerged." Holmes gestured for me to take a seat, and poured coffee with the air of a man prepared to be patient with views he did not share. "Please continue, Inspector." Lestrade consulted his notebook with evident pleasure. "Arthur Ashcombe stands to inherit the entire estate upon Sir Reginald's death. However, my inquiries have revealed that his expenditures far exceed his current allowance. He maintains not only the establishment in St. John's Wood that you discovered, but also substantial gambling debts accumulated at several clubs. He was, in short, desperate for funds." Holmes nodded thoughtfully. "And you have documentation of these debts?" "I have statements from 3 separate creditors," Lestrade confirmed. "Arthur Ashcombe owes in excess of £2,000. His creditors were growing impatient. One had threatened legal action, which would have resulted in public scandal." "The financial motive," I observed. "It is certainly compelling." "It becomes more so," Lestrade continued, "when one considers the alterations to Sir Reginald's will. I obtained access to his solicitor's files. Sir Reginald had been contemplating changes to his testamentary arrangements. The solicitor confirms that Sir Reginald scheduled an appointment for next week to discuss substantial revisions." "Revisions that would disadvantage Arthur?" Holmes asked. The solicitor could not provide specifics, but the implication was clear. Sir Reginald intended to reduce Arthur's inheritance, possibly diverting funds to establish provisions for Edward and Miss Caroline. Arthur would have gone from sole heir to one beneficiary among several. Holmes rose and walked to the window, his hands clasped behind his back in that attitude of contemplation I knew so well. "You propose, then, that Arthur learned of his uncle's intention to alter the will, recognised that his financial situation was untenable, and decided that murder was preferable to ruin." "Precisely," Lestrade said with satisfaction. "He had motive, opportunity, and the intelligence to devise a method that would appear to be natural death. The locked room was meant to suggest impossibility, but as you yourself observed, the poison was introduced hours before death. Arthur had ample opportunity to add aconitine to the tea tray while it sat unattended in the kitchen." Holmes turned from the window. "And the fabricated Berlin letters? How do they fit into your theory?" Lestrade waved a dismissive hand. "A distraction, perhaps. Or Arthur may have created them to establish an alternative motive, should suspicion fall upon him. By making it appear that everyone in the household had reason to fear Sir Reginald's confession, he created a situation where no single suspect would stand out." "It is an elegant theory," Holmes said mildly. "I congratulate you on its construction. Shall we test it against the evidence?" We proceeded to Belgrave Square within the hour, where Lestrade had arranged for Arthur Ashcombe to be brought to the library for formal questioning. The young man entered with evident trepidation, his eyes moving from Holmes to Lestrade and back again with the wariness of a cornered animal. Holmes began not with accusations, but with seemingly innocuous questions about Arthur's relationship with his uncle. The young man's answers were guarded, offering minimal information and frequent protestations of affection and respect for the deceased. Lestrade, growing impatient with this indirect approach, intervened with his own line of inquiry. "Mr. Ashcombe, were you aware that your uncle intended to alter his will?" Arthur's face went white. I had heard rumours. Uncle Reginald made reference to reconsidering his arrangements, but he had said such things before without acting upon them. Yet this time he had scheduled an appointment with his solicitor, Lestrade pressed. An appointment that would occur within days of when he died. Rather convenient timing for someone whose financial situation was becoming desperate. "My debts are my own concern," Arthur said, his voice rising. "They have nothing to do with my uncle's death," Holmes interjected quietly. "Mr. Ashcombe, can you tell us where you were on the afternoon that the tea was prepared for your uncle?" "I was in my rooms," Arthur replied. "Reading. I saw no one until the dinner hour. No one can confirm your whereabouts during that time." Arthur hesitated. "Number 1. I was alone." Lestrade leaned forward. Then you had opportunity to enter the kitchen and poison the tea without being observed." "I had no reason to harm my uncle," Arthur protested, but his voice lacked conviction. His hands trembled as he gripped the arms of his chair. Holmes studied him with that penetrating gaze that seemed to look past surface deception to underlying truth. "Tell me, Mr. Ashcombe, when did you first learn of your uncle's intention to alter his will?" Arthur's eyes shifted away. "Perhaps a week before his death. Mr. Fenwick mentioned it in passing." "And your reaction?" "I was concerned, naturally, but I knew that any changes would be subject to my uncle's sense of family duty. I trusted that he would not leave me entirely without provision." Holmes rose and began to pace the length of the room, his hands behind his back. "Let us consider the timeline carefully. You learned of the potential changes to the will 1 week before Sir Reginald's death. Yet the Berlin letters began arriving 6 weeks earlier. The household tensions, the altered schedules, the atmosphere of anticipated crisis, all of these preceded your knowledge of the will by several weeks." "I don't see what that proves," Arthur said desperately. "It proves," Holmes replied, "that if you were indeed the author of this elaborate scheme, you constructed it before you had knowledge of the financial motive that supposedly drove you to murder. Unless you are suggesting that you possess powers of precognition, the timing is fatally inconsistent with Inspector Lestrade's theory." Lestrade frowned. Perhaps he learned of the intended changes earlier than he admits. Holmes shook his head. "I have spoken with Mr. Fenwick separately. He confirms that he mentioned Sir Reginald's appointment only 1 week ago, and only then because Arthur asked specifically about his uncle's schedule. The inquiry itself suggests Arthur was already suspicious, but it does not suggest he had been planning murder for 6 weeks. Holmes returned his attention to Arthur. "Mr. Ashcombe, I do not believe you poisoned your uncle. However, I do believe you are lying about something. Your fear when questioned is genuine, but it is not the fear of a murderer facing exposure. It is the fear of something else being discovered." The young man's resistance crumbled visibly. "I received a letter," he said quietly, 2 days before my uncle's death. It was unsigned, but it suggested that my private arrangements in St. John's Wood were known and would be revealed if I did not take certain actions. "What actions?" Holmes demanded. "I was to encourage my uncle to reconsider his planned confession, to convince him that the damage to the family would be too great. The letter suggested that if I failed, information about my situation would be sent to his solicitor and to certain members of society whose good opinion I value." "Blackmail," I said. Arthur nodded miserably. "I tried to speak with my uncle, but he dismissed my concerns. He said that his conscience mattered more than our reputations. I failed in what the letter demanded, and I feared the consequences. When he died, I was relieved, Mr. Holmes. I'm ashamed to admit it, but I was relieved. And then I feared that someone would think I had killed him to prevent my secret from being revealed." Holmes studied the young man for a long moment before speaking. "Mr. Ashcombe, you're guilty of foolishness, weak character, and a failure of moral courage, but you're not guilty of murder. You may go." After Arthur had departed, Lestrade turned to Holmes with barely concealed frustration. "You believe his story?" "I believe the letter he described is consistent with the pattern we have observed," Holmes replied. "Someone in this household was attempting to manipulate multiple parties, to create layers of motive and opportunity that would obscure the truth. Arthur's financial desperation is real, but it made him a tool rather than a perpetrator. Then who sent him the blackmail letter? Lestrade asked. The same person who created the Berlin correspondence, Holmes said. The same person who poisoned Sir Reginald. The same person who has been orchestrating this entire sequence of events from the beginning. And he moved to the window and gazed out at the square. The financial motive is tempting, Inspector, because it is simple and because it fits our expectations of how murders occur. But this murder was not about gaining money. It was about preventing loss, not of fortune, but of position, reputation, and the carefully constructed identity that depends upon both. Lestrade gathered his papers with evident disappointment. Then we are no closer to identifying the killer than we were yesterday. On the contrary, Holmes said, turning back to face us, we are considerably closer. By eliminating the obvious motive, we force ourselves to consider the less obvious but more powerful motivations at work. Tomorrow I shall demonstrate who killed Sir Reginald Ashcombe, and why they believed murder was their only refuge from truth. Sustias. He departed Belgrave Square as afternoon shadows lengthened across the elegant facades. Lestrade returned to Scotland Yard to consider his failed theory, while Holmes and I made our way back toward Baker Street through streets growing busy with the evening traffic. You knew Arthur was innocent from the beginning, I observed. I suspected it, Holmes corrected. His behaviour was that of a man hiding something, certainly, but not the particular something that would explain this crime. The murderer we seek is someone who acted not from panic or desperation for money, but from a calculated recognition that their entire existence depended upon silence. That requires a different psychology than simple greed, Watson. And you know who possesses that psychology? Holmes smiled faintly. I have known for some time. Tomorrow I shall prove it. Tonight I suggest we dine well and rest. The final act of this drama will require both physical stamina and emotional fortitude. Justice, when it arrives for those who kill from fear rather than malice, is often more melancholy than satisfying. It was a pronouncement that left me with a profound sense of unease as we made our way through the darkening streets toward the familiar comforts of Baker Street. Chapter 8. Contradictions of the Heart. The morning broke grey and cold, with a persistent drizzle that seemed to mirror the sombre nature of the task before us. Holmes had been awake since before dawn, and I found him surrounded by documents, photographs, and the accumulated notes of our investigation. He looked up as I entered, and I saw in his eyes that peculiar clarity that came when a problem had finally resolved itself in his mind. "Today, Watson," he said without preamble, "we shall address the contradictions that have troubled this case from the beginning. A crime that appears to be about greed but involves no attempt to secure the inheritance quickly. A locked room that suggests impossibility but was never truly locked against the method employed. A household where everyone had motive but only one possessed the specific combination of knowledge, access, and desperation." I poured coffee and settled into my chair. "You have determined the murderer beyond doubt?" "I have eliminated every alternative explanation," Holmes replied, "which amounts to the same thing. This morning I shall demonstrate not merely who committed the crime, but why the very nature of their position made murder seem the only possible course." We arrived at Belgrave Square to find the household already assembled in the drawing-room at Holmes's request. The atmosphere was thick with tension, each person maintaining careful distance from the others, as though proximity might suggest complicity. Lady Ashcombe sat with rigid composure, while Arthur stood by the fireplace, his face drawn and exhausted. Edward occupied a chair in the corner, his posture suggesting a man who wished to disappear entirely. Miss Caroline sat beside her aunt, her hands folded in her lap with that same desperate control I had observed before. Mr. Fenwick stood near the door, his expression carefully neutral. Inspector Lestrade was present as well, accompanied by 2 constables, whose presence transformed the gathering from a social occasion into something more official and ominous. Holmes took his position at the centre of the room and began without ceremony. "I have called you together to explain how Sir Reginald Ashcombe was murdered and to identify his killer. The solution when properly understood, is both simpler and more complex than any theory we have previously entertained. He moved to a small table where he'd arranged certain exhibits: the transcribed Berlin letters, samples of handwriting from each household member, the blackmail note sent to Arthur, and the fragments recovered from the fireplace. Let us begin with the contradictions. First, we have a crime supposedly motivated by financial gain. Yet the supposed beneficiary made no attempt to prevent the investigation that might expose him. Arthur Ashcombe, despite inheriting the estate, immediately permitted full access to his uncle's papers and actively cooperated with every inquiry. This is not the behaviour of a man who has murdered for money. Arthur's face showed relief, though he remained silent. Second contradiction, Holmes continued. We have a household where everyone claims to have feared Sir Reginald's threatened confession, yet no one attempted to dissuade him before the Berlin letters arrived. The letters themselves were designed to force Sir Reginald toward confession, not to prevent it. This suggests that the murderer's goal was not to silence Sir Reginald permanently, but to silence him at a specific moment, after certain manipulations had been completed but before truths could be revealed. Holmes picked up the Berlin letters. These documents are forgeries, created by someone with access to Sir Reginald's diplomatic papers but not with the expertise to create truly convincing replicas of diplomatic correspondence. The cipher used is elementary. The historical reference is accurate but superficial. Most significantly, the psychological manipulation they contain is too clever by half. What do you mean? Lestrade asked. Holmes selected one particular letter. This passage threatens not Sir Reginald directly, but those he protected. It suggests that his confession would harm his family. Yet why would someone in Berlin care about the domestic consequences of a diplomatic confession? The concern is parochial. Watson. It reveals that the writer's primary anxiety was not historical accuracy but household stability. He set down the letters and moved to the handwriting samples. I've compared these writings with samples from each member of the household. The Berlin letters were disguised through the use of cipher, but certain formation habits persist even in coded text. The slant of the letters, the pressure of the pen, the rhythm of composition, these cannot be entirely concealed. Holmes paused, his gaze moving across each face. The handwriting analysis eliminates Arthur, whose script is too crude, and Edward, whose hand shows the tremor of nervous disorder. It eliminates Miss Caroline, whose education produced a distinctly feminine hand. It even eliminates Lady Ashcombe, who was not resident in this house when the letters began arriving. That leaves only Mr. Fenwick, Lestrade said with satisfaction. Holmes held up a cautioning hand. Patience, Inspector. We must examine not merely who could have written the letters, but who had reason to do so. Mr. Fenwick possessed the necessary access to Sir Reginald's papers. He had the education to construct plausible historical references. He delivered the final meal that contained the poison. Yet consider the contradictions in his behaviour. Holmes turned to face the secretary directly. Mr. Fenwick, you claim absolute loyalty to Sir Reginald. You describe him as your benefactor and protector. Yet if you murdered him, you destroyed the source of your own security. Sir Reginald's death leaves you without position or prospects. How does this serve your interests? Fenwick met Holmes's gaze steadily. It does not serve them, Mr. Holmes. Which is why I did not murder him. Holmes nodded slowly. Precisely. And yet you are lying about something. You know more than you have revealed. You have protected someone throughout this investigation. The secretary's composure finally cracked. I have protected Sir Reginald's memory, he said quietly. I have protected the dignity of this household. But I have not protected a murderer. Holmes studied him for a long moment. No, you have not. Because the murderer is not you, despite having the means and opportunity. The question is why someone with your intelligence and loyalty would create such elaborate false evidence, pointing to motives you knew to be insufficient. I created nothing, Fenwick said, but his voice lacked conviction. Holmes moved to stand before him. You did not create the Berlin letters, but you discovered them. Did you not? You found them among the papers of someone else in this household, and being loyal to that person, being bound to them by ties stronger than your loyalty to Sir Reginald, you attempted to modify the evidence, to make it appear that multiple parties might be guilty, to obscure the trail that led to someone you were protecting. Fenwick said nothing, but I saw the truth of Holmes's deduction in the way his shoulders sagged. Holmes turned back to address the room. The murderer we seek is someone whom Mr. Fenwick would protect despite his loyalty to Sir Reginald. Someone whose destruction would represent for him a personal catastrophe beyond mere unemployment. Someone with whom he shared a bond that transcended professional obligation. The silence that followed was profound. I watched the faces of those assembled, seeing realization dawn in some eyes while others remained confused. Holmes continued, his voice gentler now. Consider the timeline carefully. The Berlin letters begin arriving 6 weeks before Sir Reginald's death. During this period, Sir Reginald grows increasingly withdrawn and begins making arrangements to confess his historical deception. Then, 1 week before his death, he schedules an appointment with his solicitor, not to alter his will, as everyone assumed, but to make provisions for someone not legally entitled to inherit. He paused, allowing the implication to settle. Sir Reginald had discovered something about someone in his household, something that changed his understanding of his responsibilities and his sense of what justice required. The Berlin letters were created not to force his confession, but to prevent him from making these new arrangements, to eliminate him before he could legally formalize a decision that would alter the household forever. Who would benefit from preventing such arrangements? Lestrade asked, his frustration evident. Holmes turned to face Miss Caroline Ashcombe directly. Not who would benefit, Inspector, but who would lose everything. Miss Caroline, when did you learn that your father was not your natural father? The young woman's face went utterly white. The room seemed to contract around her as every eye turned in her direction. When did you discover, Holmes continued quietly, that you were the illegitimate daughter of Mr. James Fenwick and Sir Reginald's first wife? That your father, the man you called father, had raised you as his own to protect both his wife's reputation and his own pride? And when did you realize that his planned confession would include this truth, legitimizing Mr. Fenwick's claim to provide for you and potentially forcing a public acknowledgement of your true parentage? Miss Caroline rose slowly from her chair, her composure finally shattering. Her voice, when she spoke, was barely audible. I learned 3 months ago. I found letters among my mother's things, letters that made everything clear. And you created the Berlin correspondence, Holmes said, to force Sir Reginald toward a confession that would destroy his credibility before he could reveal your true parentage. But he recognized your hand in the deception, and instead of confronting you, he decided to make provisions for both you and Fenwick, to acknowledge the truth and provide for you properly. So I killed him, Miss Caroline said simply. I killed him because I could not bear the disgrace. I could not bear to be revealed as illegitimate, to lose my position, to become the object of society's pity and contempt. I killed him to preserve the lie that had protected me all my life. The confession hung in the air like a physical thing. Fenwick moved toward her instinctively, then stopped, his face a mask of anguish. Lady Ashcombe had buried her face in her hands, while Arthur stared at his cousin with an expression of shocked comprehension. Holmes's voice was almost gentle as he asked the final question. How did you know about the aconitine? My mother's garden, Miss Caroline replied. She cultivated monkshood for its beauty. After she died, I maintained her gardens. I knew which plants were poisonous. I knew how to prepare them. It was simply a matter of waiting for the right moment, when the tea sat unattended and everyone else was occupied with their own concerns. She looked around the room at the faces of those who'd been her family. I'm not sorry he is dead. I'm only sorry that it accomplished nothing. The truth is revealed anyway, and I shall face disgrace in the dock rather than in society. Perhaps that is justice. Lestrade moved forward with the constables, and Miss Caroline Ashcombe was taken into custody with a quiet dignity that was more heartbreaking than any display of emotion might have been. As we departed Belgrave Square for the final time, I turned to Holmes with the question that had troubled me throughout his exposition. You knew she was guilty before today. Why did you allow the investigation to proceed in such a manner? Because, Watson, Holmes replied quietly, I needed to understand why. A young woman of good character does not commit murder lightly. I needed to comprehend the weight of disgrace that made death seem preferable to revelation. Only by understanding that weight could I properly present the case, and ensure that justice, when delivered, would be tempered with comprehension of the desperation that drove her actions. It was a melancholy end to a melancholy case, and as we made our way through the London streets, I reflected that Holmes had once again demonstrated his unique ability to see beyond the surface of crime to the human tragedy beneath. Chapter 9. The Preservation of Standing. The formal inquiry into the death of Sir Reginald Ashcombe was held 3 days after Miss Caroline's arrest. He is in chambers at the Old Bailey that seemed designed to strip away all pretence of dignity from those who entered. I attended at Holmes's request, though I confess I found the proceedings deeply distressing. To watch a young woman of evident refinement reduced to the status of prisoner, to hear her life dissected by lawyers and examined by magistrates, was to witness the complete dismantling of the social order she had killed to preserve. Holmes was called to provide his testimony, and I was struck by the care with which he presented his conclusions. He did not dwell upon the sensational aspects of the case, nor did he embellish his own role in its resolution. Instead, he laid out the evidence with clinical precision, building his case link by link until the chain of reasoning became unassailable. The court heard first of the Berlin correspondence, which Holmes demonstrated through documentary analysis and handwriting comparison to have been written by Miss Caroline herself. He presented the draft versions discovered among her personal effects after her arrest, showing how she had refined her approach over several attempts before settling upon the final form. These letters, Holmes explained to the assembled court, were not designed to extort money, or even to prevent Sir Reginald's confession directly. They were psychological instruments, calculated to create a state of household tension that would make his death appear to be one among several possible outcomes. Miss Ashcombe constructed a situation where multiple parties appeared to have motive, thereby obscuring her own singular purpose. The prosecution's counsel, a severe man named Harrow, pressed Holmes on this point. You are suggesting, Mr. Holmes, that the defendant engaged in an elaborate deception simply to create the appearance of multiple suspects. Not merely to create that appearance, Holmes corrected, but to force Sir Reginald into a position where his confession would seem inevitable. She needed him to believe that revelation was his only honourable course, knowing that such revelation would destroy his credibility. Once disgraced, his subsequent plans to acknowledge her true parentage would appear to be the desperate fabrications of a discredited man. But he died before making any public statement, the counsel observed. Because Miss Ashcombe recognised that he had seen through her deception, Holmes replied, Sir Reginald understood that the letters were manufactured, and rather than confronting her directly, he decided to formalise provisions for both her and Mr. Fenwick. This legal acknowledgement would have revealed her illegitimacy regardless of his diplomatic disgrace. She had to act before those arrangements could be completed. The court then heard medical testimony confirming the presence of aconitine in Sir Reginald's system. I was called upon to describe my examination of the body and the symptoms that had first suggested poisoning rather than natural death. The coroner provided additional details regarding the amount of poison required and the likely time frame of its administration. Mr. Fenwick was questioned at length about his role in the household and his relationship to Miss Caroline. It was clear that the questioning caused him profound distress, though he answered with the same careful precision he had displayed throughout our investigation. I am Miss Caroline's natural father, he stated clearly, though the words seemed to cost him great effort. Her mother and I formed an attachment before her marriage to Sir Reginald. When Caroline was born, Sir Reginald chose to raise her as his own daughter. I accepted employment in his household so that I might remain close to her, though we maintained the fiction that I was merely his secretary." "Did Miss Ashcombe know of your true relationship?" the defence counsel asked. "Not until recently," Fenwick replied. "She discovered letters her mother had preserved. Once she knew the truth, she came to me seeking explanation. I told her that Sir Reginald had been generous beyond measure, that he had protected both her and me, and that we owed him gratitude rather than resentment, and yet she chose murder," the counsel observed. Fenwick's composure finally broke. "She chose preservation," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "She chose to protect the only identity she had ever known. I failed her as a father by not being able to offer her an alternative to that desperate choice." The defence attempted to argue that Miss Caroline had acted under extreme emotional distress, that the discovery of her illegitimacy had temporarily unbalanced her reason. They presented testimony regarding her exemplary character prior to the crime, her devotion to charitable works, and the shock of learning her true parentage. Holmes was recalled to address these arguments. He stood in the witness box with that same calm authority he brought to every undertaking, and his words carried a weight that seemed to still the very air in the courtroom. "I do not question Miss Ashcombe's previous good character," he stated, "nor do I minimise the profound shock of discovering one's true parentage. However, the evidence demonstrates sustained calculation rather than temporary madness. She created the Berlin correspondence over a period of weeks. She researched the poison and its preparation with systematic care. She identified the precise moment when opportunity would present itself and acted upon that moment with remarkable self-possession." Holmes paused, his gaze moving to where Miss Caroline sat in the dock. Most significantly, she demonstrated sophisticated understanding of human psychology. She manipulated not only her father, both the man who raised her and the man who sired her, but the entire household. She created a web of apparent motives that would lead investigation away from the truth. This is not the behaviour of someone temporarily unbalanced by emotional shock. It is the behaviour of someone who concluded, after careful consideration, that murder was an acceptable price for preserving social position. The defence counsel objected strenuously, but Holmes's testimony had struck at the heart of their case. The subsequent deliberations were brief, and the verdict, when delivered, surprised no one in attendance. Miss Caroline Ashcombe was found guilty of murder with a recommendation for mercy based upon her youth and the mitigating circumstances of her discovery. The judge, in pronouncing sentence, he spoke at length about the tragedy of a young woman of good family driven to such desperate measures by the weight of social expectation. "You have committed a terrible crime," he stated, "not to gain wealth or satisfy vengeance, but to prevent the revelation of circumstances beyond your control. Society has placed upon women of your class a burden of respectability that admits no deviation, no acknowledgement of human frailty. You chose murder rather than face the disgrace of illegitimacy, and in doing so you have destroyed not only your victim but yourself." The sentence was death, commuted immediately to life imprisonment given her age and the peculiar circumstances of her crime. Miss Caroline received the judgment with the same composed dignity she had maintained throughout, though I saw her hand reach briefly toward Mr. Fenwick before the warders led her away. Outside the court, Holmes and I stood in the grey London afternoon as crowds dispersed around us. Lestrade approached, his expression troubled despite the successful conclusion of the case. "A sad business, Mr. Holmes," he said. "A young woman's life destroyed because she could not bear to lose her place in society." Holmes nodded slowly. "It raises uncomfortable questions about the nature of the society that creates such desperation, Inspector. When the appearance of respectability becomes more valuable than life itself, we must ask whether we have constructed a civilization or merely an elaborate prison." We made our way through the streets toward Baker Street, neither of us inclined toward conversation. The case had been solved, justice delivered according to law, Yet I felt none of the satisfaction that typically accompanied Holmes's successes. "You knew from the beginning that this would be the outcome," I said at last. "You knew she would be convicted and imprisoned." "I knew that she had committed murder," Holmes replied. "I knew that she must face the consequences of that choice. But I also recognized that her desperation was born of a system that offers women few alternatives between perfect respectability and complete ruin. Miss Caroline Ashcombe is guilty, Watson, but she is not the only one who bears responsibility for what occurred." "Who else bears responsibility?" I asked. "All of us," Holmes said quietly. "Everyone who maintains the fiction that birth and legitimacy determine human worth. Everyone who enforces social rules so rigid that violation seems worse than death. And Sir Reginald himself bears responsibility for perpetuating a deception that, however kindly meant, denied his daughter knowledge of her own identity until the revelation could only bring destruction." We walked the remainder of the distance in silence. When we reached Baker Street, Holmes paused before entering and turned to look back at the city spread before us in the gathering darkness. "Some day, Watson, perhaps society will value truth over appearance, substance over form. Until that day arrives, we shall continue to see crimes born not of malice, but of desperation to maintain impossible standards. Miss Caroline Ashcombe is guilty of murder, but she's also a victim of the very system she killed to preserve." It was an observation that left me with much to contemplate as we climbed the familiar stairs to our rooms. The case was closed, the mystery solved, but the larger questions it raised remained unanswered. Holmes settled into his chair and took up his pipe, gazing into the fire with that distant expression that suggested his mind was already moving beyond the particulars of this investigation to the broader implications it revealed. I took my own seat and began to organise my notes, knowing that this case would prove one of the most difficult to record. How does one write about murder, committed not from evil intent but from the terror of social disgrace? How does one convey the tragedy of a young woman driven to kill the man who had protected her, all to preserve a fiction that was doomed to collapse regardless of her actions? These questions occupied my thoughts well into the evening, and when I finally set aside my pen, I had written nothing but the heading that would eventually identify this case in my chronicles, the Berlin Correspondence. The title seemed inadequate to capture the complexity of what had transpired, yet perhaps that inadequacy was itself instructive. Some cases cannot be reduced to simple narratives of right and wrong, guilt and innocence. Some cases force us to confront uncomfortable truths about the world we have constructed, and the terrible costs that world sometimes extracts from those who fail to conform to its expectations. Holmes had fallen asleep in his chair, his pipe cold in his hand, his face peaceful in repose. I covered him with a blanket and retired to my own room, carrying with me the weight of knowledge that justice, however necessary, does not always bring resolution, and that solving a mystery does not necessarily provide answers to the deeper questions it raises. Chapter 10. Order. Rewritten. The weeks following Miss Caroline Ashcombe's conviction brought a series of developments that demonstrated, perhaps more clearly than the trial itself, the peculiar nature of the tragedy we had witnessed. Holmes maintained a careful watch over the disposition of Sir Reginald's affairs, not from any official capacity, but from that sense of completeness that characterised his approach to every investigation. He needed to see not merely the crime solved, but its consequences properly understood. The estate passed to Arthur Ashcombe as originally intended, though the terms were modified by the discovery of Sir Reginald's final will, executed mere days before his death. The document made provision for Mr. Fenwick, and settling upon him an annuity sufficient to maintain modest independence. It also established a trust for Miss Caroline, to be administered during her imprisonment and to provide for her upon release, should such an eventuality occur. Most significantly, the will included a sealed letter, to be opened only by the executors, in which Sir Reginald acknowledged Caroline's true parentage and expressed his wish that she be treated with the compassion due to one who had borne the weight of deception through no fault of her own. The letter was read, noted in the official proceedings, and then quietly suppressed by mutual agreement of all interested parties. The public record would show only that Sir Reginald had made generous provision for his daughter and his secretary. The truth of their relationship would remain confined to legal documents accessible only to those with legitimate interest in the estate's administration. It was this suppression, more than anything else, that prompted Holmes to make an observation that has remained with me ever since. We were sitting in our rooms at Baker Street on an evening some 6 weeks after the trial's conclusion. Holmes had received a letter from Lady Ashcombe, thanking him for his discretion and informing him that the household in Belgrave Square would be maintained, though in altered form. Arthur would reside there when in London, while Edward had been given the use of a smaller property in the country. Mr. Fenwick had departed for the Continent, yet unable to bear remaining in England where every street might remind him of his failure to protect his daughter from her own desperation. Holmes read the letter aloud, then set it aside with an expression I could not quite decipher. "Society has a remarkable capacity for absorption, Watson," he observed. "A month ago the Ashcombe household was threatened with complete exposure and disgrace. Now the machinery of respectability has processed the scandal and produced an acceptable narrative. Sir Reginald died of natural causes, according to the social record, though the legal record knows otherwise. His daughter is imprisoned for a crime of passion, driven temporarily mad by grief. The rest of the household continues as though nothing fundamental has changed." "But everything has changed," I protested. "Miss Caroline will spend decades in prison. Mr. Fenwick has been driven into exile. The truth of her parentage is now a matter of legal record." "The truth is a matter of sealed legal record," Holmes corrected. "There is a distinction. The truth exists, yes, but it has been rendered inaccessible to general knowledge. Society has agreed, collectively and without explicit discussion, that certain facts are better left unexamined. The machinery of respectability has functioned precisely as designed. It has contained the damage and restored the appearance of order." He rose and moved to the window, gazing down upon Baker Street with that reflective expression that indicated he was examining not merely the specific case but the larger patterns it revealed. "Consider what has been preserved, Watson. Arthur Ashcombe retains his inheritance and his position in society. His irregular establishment in St. John's Wood remains unmentioned in any official proceeding. Edward Ashcombe continues to be supported, his past financial scandals safely buried. Even Miss Caroline, imprisoned for murder, is protected from the revelation of illegitimacy that she feared more than death itself. The public believes she killed to prevent her father's diplomatic confession, not to conceal her own parentage. The very secret she murdered to protect has been protected by those who condemned her for the murder." I found myself troubled by the implications of his analysis. "You are suggesting that society conspired to hide the truth, even while punishing the crime committed to hide that same truth." "I am suggesting that society is held together less by law than by the collective agreement to forget," Holmes replied. "We punish murder because we must, but we preserve reputations because we believe the social order depends upon them." Miss Caroline understood this instinctively. She gambled that even if caught, the truth she sought to conceal would be concealed by others for their own reasons. In a perverse sense, she was correct. "But she is still imprisoned," I pointed out. "She did not escape the consequences of her actions." "No," Holmes agreed. "She faces legal consequences which are severe and just, but she has avoided the social consequences she feared more than imprisonment or even death. She will serve her sentence as a woman of good family driven to crime by understandable if misguided motives. She will not serve it as a bastard who killed her adoptive father to prevent exposure. The hierarchy of disgrace has been maintained even in her conviction." He returned to his chair and took up his pipe, filling the room with smoke as he continued his reflection. "I have spent much of my career, Watson, pursuing truth through observation and deduction. I've believed that facts, properly assembled, lead inevitably to justice. But this case has reminded me that truth and justice are not always aligned. and that society sometimes requires the suppression of truth to maintain the order upon which justice itself depends. I considered his words carefully before responding. "You believe Miss Caroline should have been acquitted?" "Not at all," Holmes said firmly. "She committed premeditated murder and must face the consequences prescribed by law. But I observe that the same society that condemns her killing has tacitly approved her motive. We imprison her for taking a life, but we protect the secret for which that life was taken. We validate her fear even as we punish her response to it." The conversation continued well into the evening, ranging across questions of justice, truth, and the social order that had produced this particular tragedy. Holmes was unusually philosophical, perhaps because the case had touched upon issues that transcended the usual boundaries of criminal investigation. As the hour grew late and our discussion wound toward its natural conclusion, Holmes made one final observation that has shaped my understanding not only of this case but of many that followed. "In the end, Watson, we are all complicit in the systems that govern our lives. Miss Caroline killed to preserve her place in a society that would have destroyed her for circumstances of birth over which she had no control. We investigated and secured her conviction according to laws designed to protect that same society. The household that she sought to protect has been largely preserved, their secrets maintained through legal mechanisms designed to serve justice. Everyone has behaved according to their role, and order has been restored. Yet I cannot escape the feeling that we have solved nothing essential. We have simply rearranged the elements of the problem without addressing its fundamental cause." "And what is that cause?" I asked. "The belief," Holmes said quietly, "that reputation and social standing constitute a form of property worth killing to defend and worth dying to preserve. But until that belief is challenged, we shall continue to see crimes like this one. Murders committed not from evil intent, but from terror of exposure, not from greed, but from desperation to maintain impossible standards." I made no reply, for there seemed nothing adequate to say. We sat in companionable silence as the fire burned low and London settled into the profound quiet of late evening. The case was closed, the criminal convicted, the household restored to functionality. By every conventional measure, justice had been served. Yet Holmes's words lingered in my mind as I prepared this account for my records. I have written of many of my friend's cases, chronicling his remarkable gifts of observation and deduction, but none has troubled me quite so much as this one, where the solution of the mystery only deepened the questions it raised. The Berlin correspondence, as I have titled this case, was not truly about letters from Germany or diplomatic falsification, or even murder in a locked room. It was about the weight that society places upon appearances, and the terrible costs that weight can exact from those who fail to meet its expectations. Miss Caroline Ashcombe killed to preserve a fiction, and in the end, society preserved that same fiction, even while condemning her for the killing. We are all, as Holmes observed, complicit in maintaining the order that makes such tragedies possible. I set down my pen with the uncomfortable awareness that I have recorded not a triumph of detection, but an indictment of the world in which we live. Holmes has solved the case with his characteristic brilliance, but the solution has illuminated problems that lie beyond the reach of any detective's powers to resolve. The Ashcombe household continues in Belgrave Square, its hierarchy subtly redefined but essentially intact. Arthur manages the estate with greater maturity than he previously displayed. Edward has found a measure of peace in his country retreat. Lady Ashcombe maintains her position in society with undiminished dignity. Mr. Fenwick writes occasionally from abroad, his letters speaking of a quiet life devoted to scholarly pursuits. Miss Caroline serves her sentence with exemplary behaviour, her true story known only to those bound by law and discretion to keep it secret. Order has been restored, reputations preserved where possible, justice delivered according to law. The machinery of civilization has processed this particular disruption and continued its inexorable turning. And yet, on those occasions when I pass through Belgrave Square and observe those elegant facades that seem to embody permanence and propriety, I cannot help but remember Holmes's words about the collective agreement to forget. Behind each respectable door lie secrets that someone has chosen to keep, truths that someone has decided must remain hidden, deceptions that serve to maintain the social order. We live, all of us, in houses built upon carefully guarded silences. Miss Caroline Ashcombe merely learned that lesson earlier and more tragically than most, and paid a price that society deemed appropriate even as it worked to preserve the very secret for which that price was exacted. Holmes has moved on to other cases, other mysteries demanding his unique talents. But I know that this particular investigation changed something in his view of the world we inhabit. He solves crimes as brilliantly as ever, but he does so now with an awareness that justice, however carefully administered, exists within a system that sometimes values order over truth and appearance over substance. It is an uncomfortable knowledge, but it is knowledge nonetheless. And perhaps that is the real legacy of the Berlin Correspondence, not the solution of a murder, but the revelation of the compromises upon which civilized society depends.